So where we're headed tonight is the last three, and they're really not the last three metaphors for atonement. They're just the last three I'm giving you. If you want to keep going for the rest of your life, you can do that. There's plenty more to go on this. So why don't we open with a word of prayer, and then we'll go forward. Gracious God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the chance to think again and to think anew, to think ourselves into other people's shoes for a moment, to draw into what you and your Son and your Spirit do on our behalf, and how that moves and shapes and changes us in profound ways. We pray this in your holy name. Amen. Amen. So, I don't know about you, but my assumption is that many of us grew up in worlds where we cannot or were not allowed to critique the Bible. Right? You were given the Bible, and your job was to receive it and do what it says. I was handed the Bible means basic instructions before leaving Earth, and that's what you have. And so it's your instruction book, and you don't question an instruction book; you just do what it says. Those in the category we're talking about tonight resist that greatly. So, if you hold an understanding that the Bible is uncritiquable, tonight you will be very uncomfortable. My encouragement in that is to listen to the hearts of the ideas the people we're talking about are presenting tonight, and try to understand why they come from a place of critique that might be very different than yours or mine or other people's. So, to kind of open this up, I want to take us back just for a moment to a piece of last week's conversation when we talked about the scapegoat theory or mimetic theory. And in the scapegoat theory, everything as we knew atonement theory was reversed. What do I mean by that? The way prior to mimetic theory or scapegoat theory, the mob that initially saw itself as righteous, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, were seen as innocent people, innocent men specifically, ridding society of an evil man, Jesus. The Roman soldiers who nailed Christ to the cross were seen as mere agents of a benevolent and just society who worked together to kill a man guilty of what they deemed punishable by death, of a crime that was punishable by death. And for them, that was death on a cross. Jesus' crime. Jesus declared himself the Son of God, and in doing so, namely, that he was equal with God. The mimetic theory or the scapegoat theory reverses this. It places the wrongs on the head of society, the mad and rabid and foaming at the mouth rage. Oh, no, please. We did that the first day before anybody got here. So just move down a chair and we'll throw that one out. You're not the first. And let me be clear, you didn't break these chairs. They've been choir chairs in this church since like 1802. They've been here for a long time. They were repurposed and recovered, so you're great.
It must be this theory.
Exactly. Yeah. We'll scapegoat you, don't worry. It's all good. So, it reverses the guilt, right? Mimetic theory or scapegoat theory reverses the guilt. It places the wrongs on the heads of society. The mad, the rabid, the foaming at the mouth, rage-filled society is the one at fault. And the victim, once and for all, not just for Jesus, but once and for all time, is innocent and righteous and just. So it places the wrongs on the heads of society. And this mimetic theory or scapegoat theory merges really well with what we're going to talk about in liberationist and feminist atonement theories.
Preston, that was really an amazing about face. I've never thought about that. And I'm thinking about it also in the context of, like, I don't know, stuff going on today. So that total switch, to what extent was that an actual issue? Do we believe or do we know at that time where, like, marching on the left became marching on the right, and, you know, good was made bad, bad was made good? That's pretty momentous.
It is pretty momentous. And Rene Girard gets a lot of white credit for a lot of POC thought. And we're going to talk about that. So he gets credit, Rene Girard passed in 90-something, early 2000s, recently. And he was writing this kind of mimetic theory stuff really over the last 20, 30 years. You go way further back into Black preaching, Latin American preaching. You see this understanding the victim as central to the theological core. And so, does that help answer that question a little bit? Like, it's been around for much longer than we've given it a atonement theory title.
Gotcha. So that's cool. That's an excellent additional answer. I'm wondering, back 2,000 years ago, how much of a switch was there? Like, this guy that got, what he deserved, we're now worshiping?
Right.
I mean, to what extent do we have any indication from church?
Yeah, so like I was reading this week, and I'll forget the author's name, but I was digging deeper into some of these things, knowing that I had a little bit more time because I was going to be rushed through this last week. So I was like, wait, I got some playtime, let's play. And one of the pieces that I read talked about that one of the primary critiques of from Romans of the Christian church was that it was too effeminate. That Jesus didn't look like Caesar. And that there was this, it's not masculine enough and therefore we're out. Right? Which gets at this same, right? Jesus already took everything and turned it upside down. The kingdom of God is radically transversed from the kingdom of the world. And that permeates the text. It permeates the way of Jesus. It permeates how Jesus engages with women, how he engages with prostitutes, how he engages with lepers, all of these stories is so different from the empire and even the religious empire that, it was, right? Like, again, we've talked a few weeks about, metaphor versus doctrine, right? So these metaphors were rich already, and these doctrines are picking up on them and playing with them in different ways. So we'll come back to this. So this is the focus for tonight, so you'll get there, I think. So this kind of mimetic thing connects with liberation theology and feminist theology in different ways. Black liberation theology, and the first ever black liberation theologian, well, that's not true. The first one to own the word black liberation theology, Professor James Cone, wrote a seminal text called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. So if you want a discourse on atonement and what atonement means in black theology, you should go buy that book. It'll make you really uncomfortable for all the right reasons. So The Cross and the Lynching Tree, Cone writes, in the lynching era between 1880 and 1940, white Christians lynched nearly 5,000 black men and women and children in a manner with obvious echoes of the Roman crucifixion of Jesus. Yet these Christians did not see the irony or the contradiction in their actions. And again, he says, the gospel of Jesus is not a rational concept to be explained in a theory of salvation, but a story about God's presence in Jesus' solidarity with the oppressed, which led to his death on the cross. What is redemptive is the faith that God snatches victory out of defeat, life out of death, and hope out of despair. So, right, this is a very different way of talking than the other things that we've been playing with. God's presence, right, the salvific reality, is not the cross, but God's presence in Jesus' solidarity with the oppressed. That's the salvific space. So liberation theories of atonement argue that to understand the real meaning of the cross and to get at a real theology of atonement, we have to listen to people who have suffered. So, for example, in the United States, African Americans have suffered greatly. Only 400 years ago, and moving forward, were they captured and sold into slavery, transported across the Atlantic, and made to work in forced labor camps called plantations. Even after emancipation and the Reconstruction amendments to the Constitution, they continued to suffer under Jim Crow laws and segregation. So, as theologian James Cone points out in The Cross and Lynching Tree, African Americans were subject to terror unmitigated by the law. The Ku Klux Klan, P.S., which understands itself as a Christian entity, paraded at night, burning crosses in the lawns of blacks, and frequently beat those that they considered uppity. The homes, businesses, and churches of African Americans were burned as warnings. The worst form of violence was that of lynching of black men, women, and children by hanging them on a tree, usually accompanied by torture and the burning of the corpse as it still hung. And these lynchings, some 5,000 plus over a period from the Civil War to the 1950s, were not private affairs. Indeed, it was not uncommon to have them advertised in newspapers, and thousands of white folk, men, women, and children, would show up and watch and jeer Food was sold like you were at a fair, and photographers would be taking pictures and reproduce them as postcards. And all those involved in these lynchings were Christian. The lynchings were a warning threat to our black brothers and sisters that we whites are in power and we will never let go and we can do to you whatever we want. Rebellion wasn't an option. The use of violence in defense would only engender a worse response. The Second Amendment tended to only apply to white folk. In the first half of the 20th century, many blacks traveled north to get jobs, working in factories and to get away from sharecropping. However, in the north, they encountered as much discrimination. The sufferings of the black community were often expressed in one of two places. One of them was the juke joint on Saturday night, the places where men and women could dance to jazz and listen to performers sing the blues. The other place was the historic black church, where they sang of a Savior who had suffered like them. In black theology, it is not so much that Jesus suffers for us, it's that Jesus suffers with us. This is an essential distinctive in understanding a turn in ideology. This reveals the love of God, which is for the downtrodden and the abused. The ultimate vindication is found in the resurrection, which seems impossible. But then equal rights for blacks seemed impossible in the 1950s too. Yes, it may be that Jesus died for our sins, but far more important was that God was on the side of justice for the oppressed and the victim. And this is true in both Latin American theologies and black theologies.
Let me add something.
Please.
One of the things that's really interesting in liberation theology is to move from domination to liberation, which is the way that it was perceived. Like regular theology was used to keep control of people, and this was a flip to how we actually free people from oppression through this. And when you're talking about social justice issues, the way that that showed up for people, when we talk about like social justice, we only talk about dehumanization of people. And you can look at it. You can look at, in the Constitution, all these things, there were 2/3 of people, right? They didn't even have full human rights. When you're talking about spiritualization too, there was a de-spiritualization of people.
Mm-hmm.
Because if people were less than human, then they were also less than spiritual. It's like looking at somebody as not just do their bodies matter, but do their souls matter. And that's at the core of what this movement was about too. It was moving people from the slavery times, which were, hey, we have Bibles that remove all the Bible verses about freedom and about liberation. It was a slave Bible. That's actually what it did. It was literally picked apart. To this whole movement of how we actually use these things for freedom.
So simultaneously as Cone is writing his work, there's a Latin American Peruvian theologian named Gustavo Gutierrez writing Latin American liberation theology. And one of my favorite stories of these two people, James Cone is about 6'4", tall black man, beautiful big hair. And in the early days of these liberation theologies coming out, they were holding conferences in New York, and Gustavo Gutierrez came over and they were sitting on a stage, and Gustavo Gutierrez is about this tall, Peruvian, Indian, tiny guy. And James Cone leans over to Gustavo and says, how is it possible that we wrote the same text from thousands of miles apart? And Gustavo reaches over and grabs James Cone's arm and sticks it next to his and says, we're the same. Right? That there was an understanding, a getting that happens only from the voice of victim, only from the voice of the oppressed. And so Gustavo takes, even deeper in different places. But part of what he says, piggybacking on what Roy says, is that liberation is a complex and dynamic reality. It's not simply removing a slave's chains. That is the first step to liberation. Or as he would say, the first dimension. He says because it happens simultaneously over and over and over again, and it's having to be relived at each moment. But he says there's 4 dimensions to liberation. One is the chains are removed. Second is socially a person is freed, right? So the first 2 have to do with societal implications. That the society is no longer putting chains on you, and the society sees you as a free person too. The next 2 steps, one is the spiritual, which Roy brought into this conversation so beautifully, and the 4th is the personal. That if you've been living as an oppressed person, it's not like you just turn that off. Which is why many sharecroppers didn't leave sharecropping and still weren't being paid for what they were doing. They were just freed slaves. So what the critique of Latin American liberation theology and Black liberation theology, and so I want to say here, and you're going to hear me critique it in a minute from the female side, is even the liberation theologies were rooted in manness. So there is also Black liberation feminist theologies called womanist, and there's Latin American liberation theologies called mujerista, and these realities are something you should be reading, something you should be tapping into, because part of what our Black sisters and Latina sisters said is that we're not just oppressed, we're the oppressed of the oppressed of the oppressed. Not only are we oppressed by you white people, and men and women on both that, but then we're also oppressed by our own men within our own tradition. And we have work to do. So, the critique of the traditional theories by liberationist theology was first and foremost, liberation theology opposes the reduction of atonement to a private spiritual matter. It emphasizes the need for tangible liberation from social, political, and economic oppression. What Jesus did on the cross was not just about freeing your soul. It has to free your body in this world now. There's an imperative for it. And they are not interested in any salvation that offers less than that. It also demands that atonement lead to the transformation of unjust social structures, not merely to the moral individual involvement. So they would critique the satisfaction theory and find it especially problematic because the satisfaction theory, if you go back, actually justifies violence and maintains oppressive systems under the guise of divine justice. Right? So we talked about, however many weeks we've been here now, the first week we talked about that some of these metaphors that have lived into dogmas or doctrines have created deep pain in our world. Part of what our Latin and Black and all other POC communities are inviting us to understand is that it has not been freedom for them. And I would argue that if all are not free, it's a bad theology of atonement. So, the second thing that reframes atonement and liberation theology, for them, sin becomes structural. It redefines sin as not just this personal wrongdoing or a breaking of a moral code or even a breach in relationship, but also as systematic injustice that's embedded in societal structures, such as racism and poverty and oppression and these things. They claim and require us to pay attention to these being sinful too. And often much more significant of a breach in Christ's love than even our personal sin. They also interpret Christ's life, death, and resurrection as acts of liberation, both from spiritual and physical forms of bondage. Part of what they would say is when Jesus walks in and touches a leper, he's not just freeing a leper, he's redefining how the world understands leprosy and saying it's not okay. Our systems for how we think about this are broken. When the woman is dragged before him and not the man who are caught having an affair, and he starts bending down and writing in the sand, their call is, this is an unjust system that Jesus calls on the carpet by saying, you who are without sin, cast the first stone, and puts a little bit more imagination into what he might be writing. Liberation theology stresses the historic and political implications of atonement, asserting that Christ's work has to bring about real change in material conditions of the oppressed. So within liberation theology, it also emphasizes that the oppressed are not merely passive recipients of salvation, but active participants in the struggle for justice. So Christ's death and resurrection empower the oppressed to continue the fight against systematic evil, working toward a just and equitable society where all are liberated. And so the cross becomes a system of oppression and torture, not of salvation. And the role of the church, the role of the people of faith, the ecclesia, is to take down all the people from the crosses that have been hung and to make sure it never happens again for anyone.
So, as we're hearing this, it's becoming really clear to me, and the question comes, for this, the ultimate time of atonement, the cross, why wasn't it on the Day of Atonement? Why wasn't it Yom Kippur? Why was it Passover? Right? How come? Because if it's about sin and it's about the forgiveness of sin, and that's all it is, why wouldn't it have been on the Day of Atonement?
Yeah, I think that's a great question with a lot of messy implications.
And so what I'm hearing is liberation, being set free, and as I read Paul talking about Passover, he talks Passover language.
100%. The problem, though, the problem that they would say, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, it still requires blood on a mantle. And it requires Christ's blood on a mantle so that you can be free. And they're saying all of that, to be frank, is bullshit. That all of that is just furthering systems of oppression which are destructive for our world. So their challenge to Paul would be, Paul, you missed this. Right? We want to, and I know, remember I talked about this gets really messy for people who don't feel comfortable critiquing the Bible. This is not, I'm looking for Paul to prove my theory. This is, I'm oppressed, I'm experiencing oppression, I identify with Jesus, this is it. Everything that happens to Jesus is what happens to me, to my family, to my people, and it's wrong. And Paul comes from the oppressive class. That, I think it's important for us to not try to make it clean, because they don't care about our cleanliness.
So do they view Jesus' sacrifice on the cross as not being effective because it didn't change the structure of society at that time?
Liberationists, so I'm going to go with liberationists and not talk about feminism yet, because that's a whole other world. Liberationists would say that the cross does not signify work that God is doing. The cross signifies the work of humanity on the oppressed. And that resurrection represents the work of Christ and God. And yeah, you all can pull 1,000 quotes from me of where biblical writers have tried to make meaning out of the cross. And that is something they challenge, of saying all that does is give more excuses to people in power to continue the same dance. And so we're out on that. We're not going to try to justify it. We're not going to try to make you comfortable by making sure your scriptures align in the way that you think they have to because that's how you were handed them. Which, P.S., our Jewish brothers and sisters don't even play with the text that way at all. Their entire world, from the moment they were born, was that the text was meant to be critically engaged, and the text was the starting point. And then the dance begins from there. And the work of the people of God is to keep going and keep challenging and keep questioning the way that it is. We were just handed a very 1950s frame of how we do this dance. So I hear you, and I love what you're doing, and they would say, no. Yes for you, no for us. Whether Passover, whether Yom Kippur, whether Santa Claus, whether All Saints' Day, it's furthering the oppression of people.
It feels like, as I think about this, right, one of their critiques, I'm just trying to internalize this, one of their critiques is that the way that we historically have thought about the atonement, going to the cross and the atonement is very exclusive, right? It affects a certain group of people, but not those that are oppressed.
100%.
Okay. But then I flip that around, and I'm just
Yeah.
trying to understand. Does the liberation atonement theory kind of flip that and say it's more for the oppressed than it is for
100%. So there is a preferential option for the poor and oppressed. This is at the root of historic Catholic theology and liberationist theology. It is the gift that liberation theology has given the whole world of theology, is that Jesus loves everybody, but he has a preferential option for the oppressed. That they matter first because they're suffering. And white Christians for generations have been really frustrated by that because we're not the most important thing anymore. And that's just uncomfortable. And I'm not meaning that for you. It has been a deeply uncomfortable spot where, one of the most important things you can have as a Catholic theologian is a stamp from the Vatican saying that your book is theologically the voice of the Catholic Church, and every theologian who writes a book gets one of those if they're a Catholic priest, if it aligns. And for years, people were silenced for saying this. And their works were not published, and they weren't engaged. It is the gift that Gustavo Gutierrez gave the church.
saying, they were silenced for saying that.
That there is a preferential option in God's kingdom for the poor.
He was excommunicated from the church, by the way, for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
Until not long before his death, he was brought back and raised in the church. So he did live kind of in exile for a while.
Now, it's important to note that Pope Francis is deeply trained in liberationist theology. So part of what you're seeing in him as a pope is his deep rooting theologically as a liberationist theologian. So that plays into some of the conversations. He also did some really stupid things prior to becoming pope, but that's a whole other conversation when it comes to the oppression and eradication of peoples. So what are the implications for the church and theology? According to liberation theology, a theology that does not address systematic injustice and the material conditions of human life is deemed incomplete and unacceptable and not worth believing in. Secondly, the church's mission, according to liberation theology, is to be actively involved in the social transformation, standing in solidarity with the marginalized, and removing all future victims from the crosses on which they have been placed by the ruling class. So what liberation theology does is it presents a comprehensive and dynamic view of atonement, demanding that God's reconciliation through Christ impact all aspects of human existence: social, political, economic, and spiritual. That's Gustavo Gutierrez. It challenges traditional Western theological frameworks that isolate spiritual salvation from social justice, insisting that true atonement must bring liberation here and now, not just in the afterlife. So this approach redefines the purpose of atonement, making it a tool for real-world transformation and aligning it with the core message of freedom and liberation theology and God's preferential option for the poor and the oppressed. Now, these groups always reserve the right to be suspicious. And rightly so. Because anyone who claims to be marginalized and a marginalized people, sorry, I missed that again. For anyone who claims marginalized people need to sacrifice anything, let alone their life, to gain some form of liberation, is selling a good that has already brought them deep historic pain. So what I want us to hold is a sense of sensitivity and humility and striving to understand the way that our oppressed brothers and sisters think, because these groups are always the first to be called upon when it's time to sacrifice someone. If you have any question about that, just watch the news for the last month. Because I don't know about you, my world hasn't changed. But I can personally attest, not in some hyperbolic frame, I can personally attest to how my POC friends have actually been damaged in the last month. So it matters, right? Now, are you ready to go to feminism? Any questions, any thoughts, any ideas before we jump into that? I got to take off my jacket.
Preston, I'll share that. This has been really powerful. That's the way I say that. I've heard something new, or I came to it in a new way, just in what just said is minimizing though. And what I heard you say, and you correct me if I get this wrong, but what I've heard us say in the last few minutes is that a bigger, richer way to look at the work of Jesus was to stand as a fresh expression of God's view of what human life is like in a structure that was fundamentally twisted. The Roman Empire at that point was pretty
Twisted.
pretty twisted. And you also reminded me in your answer that a couple hundred years later, like during the time when, you know, the early church, Diocletian was waging wars against the Christians because of their not being Roman enough, not being, shall I say, patriotic enough, not being enough, you know, devoted to this country and what this country stands for. And so my view of that has shifted from being on the other side of that, well, you're a white person, you're a white male, to like, no, actually that's a very human thing, which is if we don't get at the systematic issues, then we kind of haven't gotten to anything at all. And then that just, for me, just makes the gospel so much bigger and deeper. So.
Thank you, Wayne.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, the other thing I would add to what you're saying too, Wayne, is don't forget that Judaism had aligned with the empire. That's how they killed Jesus. That's how we killed Jesus, right? Was through alignment. They brought a charge that would make the empire make the decision. Now, please do not hear me say that Jews killed Jesus. Jesus was a Jew, people. So if you're hearing that in me, not saying that. I'm saying we crucified and crucify Jesus over and over and over. That's what John Sobrino says. John Sobrino says that the cross is there to remind us that we keep doing it. And that we're not free until we stop crucifying the oppressed. Our world is not liberated. We miss the salvific. In fact, we miss the beauty of what Jesus and God are doing in our world in that space. Others? Personally, I will tell you, there is not one theological frame that has changed my theology more than liberation theology. It has altered the way that I see God, the way that I see Christ, the way that I see salvation, the way that I see every piece of who I am. No worries. So, now I'm going to even make it more messy. You ready? Liberationist and feminist thinkers are right to point out that if the story promotes an innocent murder under the empire or submitting to unjust murder by something initiated by an authoritarian father figure, no less, then something's broken in that frame of thought. Because it opens the door for the powerful of our day to demand that the powerless remain in abusive situations. Likewise, it opens the door to tell the powerless in general to stay in abusive sacrificial systems in hopes that being submissive just might change the hearts and minds of those in power. Check out that last statement. It opens the door to tell the powerless in general to stay in abusive sacrificial systems in hopes that being submissive just might change the hearts and mind of those in power. And it does more than merely open the door, because the reality is it already happens. This is what's taught to wives in some of our Christian churches when their husbands are abusing them. This is what was taught by white Christian slaveholders. It's not something that's just a pie-in-the-sky idea. It happens. So one's theory of sin, or theology of sin, shapes one's theory or theology of atonement. I would even argue that one's theory of sin determines one's theory of atonement. Which is why I have us looking at these questions over and over and over again. Because A put next to a different B will always equal a different C. So many scholars who point out that one of the problems that we have in this whole dance is that it's males who have shaped the discussion of atonement. Right? I love it. Let's just name some major influences, shall we? Irenaeus and the recapitulation theory of atonement, the Cappadocian Fathers and the ransom theory, Anselm and the satisfaction theory, Abelard and the moral influence theory, the Reformers and the penal substitutionary theory, Hugo Grotius in the government theory, Gustav Allen in the Christus Victor theory, René Girard in the mimetic theory, James Cone in liberation theory, Gustavo Gutierrez in Latin American liberation theology. What don't you hear? Each theory is connected to a male. So has their maleness intruded into their theory of atonement? You just answered what every feminist has ever answered. Yes, of course it has. Rita Finger argues that the penal substitution and moral influence theories encouraged women into patterns of submission, while Christus Victor theories encouraged liberation, which is why the church has leaned away from it. Some feminists have repudiated the cross as an instrument of powerful violence against the oppressed and the powerless, like we heard in liberation theology, and have therefore sought out a theory of atonement that is crossless. Ruther, that's her primary argument, is that any atonement that makes the cross part of the atonement cannot be so. The cross, they're arguing, justifies violence against the weak. Now, if the premise above is accepted, we're in need of examining our understanding of sin, and we have to ask if males have actually shaped the discussion in light of male-ish sins, and therefore lead to male-ish forms of atonement. So do the theories of atonement that we talked about mostly focus on the curse of God against Adam in Genesis 3, or do they at all take into account the curse of God on Eve? Can it be said that women sin differently than men? that their kinds of sins, while not wholly other, are in marked contrast. So Valerie Goldstein concluded in her famous essay in the Journal of Religion in the 1960s that the temptations of women are not the same temptations of men. And Sally Ashford says, just as male sins are destructive outworkings of male experience and potentiality, so too are female sins destructive outworkings of the female experience and potentiality. That is, that the male perspective, which speaks of self-assertion as sin, may cause women to strangle such desires as in conflict with their calling to love and service of others. Right? So the part of the argument of first-tier feminism, and I'm not going to go through all of this for you, so if you need help on this, we'll have another conversation over a beer. You owe me that. Or whiskey. Or soda, I'm fine. Part of the argument of that space is we've not even been included in the conversation of your sacred texts, of your theologies. And so you can imagine why they come to the sacred text in critique. Right? They're like, we don't even have a voice, so our voice is to critique. Our voice is to challenge. Our voice is to lift up what tiny experience that we see of women in the sacred text. So to be sure, right, we have to be careful of stereotyping males and females, but avoiding such a stereotype doesn't permit us to fail to observe realities of male and female experience as shaping both sin and atonement. So here's an example. Is the inherent power structure of the world the imposition of male experience of how the male idea and the male connection to God is cracked? Right? So let me say that a different way. Our frames are so built around power and holding power. And the male experience has been historically so engaged with grabbing power. And that our sin as maleness tends to talk a lot about what it means to grab power. Is that unique from an experience of our sisters? Any thoughts?
Well, I wonder if women were allowed to lead and be strong, if they would sin more in that.
Right, so has part of their sin identity been shaped by their oppression?
Exactly.
It's a great question. Yes?
I think women like and seek power, but they don't do it in as direct a way as men do. So it may look, I think it looks differently.
Yeah.
And that's a broad brush, because all, women vary.
As do men. Thanks be to God.
So the question itself to me is odd, because I feel like there's this, we're trying to make a distinction between one person's sin versus another person's sin. I know you're talking about men versus women, but in my prior understanding, prior to 3 weeks ago when I thought I knew everything. Jesus died for all of our sin, right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like a moot point, right? It's, in my view, right, of what the atonement is, like, it doesn't matter if it's a sin of, trying to grab power, or if it's a sexual sin, or if it's a, you lie, or whatever, I mean, Jesus covered it all, right? And that was the atonement. That may be a very elementary view of what the atonement,
Yeah.
be or is, but in that sense, right, it doesn't really matter. So I'll just be frank, like, part of me is sitting here going, I feel like everybody's, not everybody, but these different theories are to say, I want to appear in this story in a certain way. So I'm writing myself into this story, and I'm going to maybe that's just the way everything is written throughout all of time, is they're going to write themselves into a story and make it a certain way. I'm just rambling, but that's
Yeah.
kind of my feeling.
So 3 things I would say to that, and chase me down if I'm rambling,
I've already been
is number 1, they would first off say that is 100% what every story is. Just people, like, they're not, like, they don't come at the sacred text as Jesus spoke this thing or God spoke this thing into people's ears and it was written down. It is 100% human experience finding the divine. Right? This is the story of humanity searching for the divine and what they experience from their side, not from the divine side. That everything you have written where we proclaim, where the Israelites claim they won a war because God was on their side, they call BS to that and say that's how they understood it because they were in power in that moment. The other people did not necessarily see that as God was against them. Right? So they're going to name the human experience side of all of this. And that's part of it, if you were looking for something fun to do that isn't related to this, but is tangential to this, is go buy a commentary on the scriptures from a liberationist perspective. Because it is a reading of the text from below, not above. They're not trying to tell you what God is doing. They're telling you what they see in the human experience from there. And it is a radically different read of the text. And I think very liberating in 1,000 ways. So number 1, they would say that. Number 2, they would say that everything you said is your privilege speaking. As a white male in power who gets to determine that your sins have been covered when my sins have never even been mentioned, would be part of the challenge of that. And so, now, again, please hear me say that while I have spent a great deal of my life studying these things, and way more in liberationist, I have a master's thesis in liberation theology. I do not have one in feminist theology. I've sat under Rosemary and took classes with many of these people I'm talking about, but I don't even scratch the surface of understanding feminist theology, and I just want to name that, right? So I'm giving you feminist theology as according to a white man who's always been in power and is a 3rd-generation graduate student in my family system. Like, let's just name that stupidity, right? So yeah, that would be part of the dance. So one of the questions they would ask to this is, what would it be like if women's experiences were imposed on the world? How might things be different? Lynn said, I've always wondered that. One thing I can guarantee you is to be less violent.
I think
Yeah.
one would be that there'd be more women in power just in general without it being thought of as a crazy idea.
Mm-hmm.
Other countries have women in power, and yet this country can't imagine having a woman in power without it being mind-blowing.
Yeah. So Ashford suggests that because males have shaped the discussion of atonement, the cross itself is often the entire point of the atonement, because it's in the cross that males find resolution for their particular problem of power. She suggests that a feminist theory of atonement will take into consideration much more deeply the life and resurrection of Jesus. Elaine Storkley, in her article Atonement and Feminism, explores how feminist theology critically engages with traditional atonement theories, particularly focusing on their implications for women. She examines how patriarchal structures within Christian theology, especially regarding atonement, continue to perpetuate gender inequality and marginalization of women, while also proposing pathways for a redemptive and an inclusive understanding for atonement. So, feminist critique of traditional theology and atonement theories, they argue that traditional atonement theories are deeply embedded in patriarchal frameworks, that they sustain domination, and they sustain subordination, and reinforce systematic oppression of women, and most specifically, systematic oppression of women who are poor and racially marginalized. Many feminist theologians also view traditional debates about salvation and atonement as actually outdated conversations altogether and sterile, shaped by patriarchal thought. So many of them would say, your whole focus on salvation and atonement would not even be a conversation if women were the ones writing theology. That there would be a different starting place. Which, I'll be frank, I don't even know how to wrap my head around that. But I know it to be true, right? That where we come from as male and female actually shifts a lot of things.
I just had the thought, not quite sure what exactly was triggered by, but that so many oppressive systems are being passed down and upheld by women, both in cultures that mutilate girls, right? It's women who keep that up, but also like thinking of even like people like Phyllis Schlafly, very powerful woman, very influenced by patriarchy in wielding that power. So
Yeah.
So women, we don't know what would have happened with women theology because
it didn't happen. Yeah.
But just women empowered by themselves might just continue to hand that down the old systems too.
Because it is our system, right? So part of what's been learned is if I want to thrive, then I have to play the game that exists. Which is why, she's resting. Which is why even women couldn't wrap their head around electing Hillary Clinton. Right? Not to be political, but to give an example. Well, to be political, but not to be partisan, but to give an example of like someone who played in the male system and still was crucified at it. So feminist critique often also highlight that the traditional portrayal of God often reflects male-centric attributes, authoritarian power, independence, and emotional detachment, resulting in a deity who is unrelatable and alienating, especially to women. And they call for an understanding of God that is much more interdependent and picking out of scriptures that draw the feminine attributes of God into the story. So sacrifice, blood, punishment, all these atonement languages are seen as reinforcing the image of a wrathful, dominating God who demands violence for justice, leading thinkers like Mary Daly to condemn Christianity as just a necrophilic religion. Right? So this is where the critique is coming out of. There's so much more here. So you can follow the train of thought. I'm not intentionally shortcoming feminist theology. I have 3 more pages. I would share that with you, but we're going to finish the last one for the sake of seeing another new version of what that looks like. I think it's important. And I want to spend all next week talking about what does this mean for how we live, and what do we do with it. So, one of the people that I've been connected with and have enjoyed reading is Jonathan Foster. Jonathan Foster is a young theologian, process and open relational theologian. I don't have time to explain either one of those words tonight, but we can, again, have another drink and I can do that. Foster and many people who are playing with atonement theories today ultimately move beyond or through traditional models proposing that what atonement is in the first place is union with God. So at one-ment, that the whole point of this journey and this conversation is how do we create union with God? So instead of seeing Jesus' death as something God requires, Foster sees it as an expression of divine love within a broken world. So Foster's commitment is to love. Not to a kitschy Hallmark pop song kind of love. He's committed to something deeper, an uncontrolling, non-violent, non-scapegoating, non-binary energy in relationship with God and creation that's actively seeking the flourishment of everyone and everything kind of love. He's committed to this because of its philosophical and biblical depth that he has played in. And because it seems to him that Jesus was committed to this kind of love too. So it's no small thing for him to read about itinerant, impoverished, powerless, brown-skinned man embodying these comments like Jesus. Right? Like for him, he's like, Jesus wasn't white. And he wasn't Christian. And when we start there, we veer off in a place where things change in a way that we got to pay attention to. So for him, when we discover concepts and language and truth and story that light up all of our psycho-spiritual and neurological pathways, and then we find someone who lived it out in real flesh and blood ways, that becomes exciting. So the work of At One-ment is this work for him that is embodied in Jesus' life and death and resurrection, but is radically active today. And it's an ongoing work of continuing to communicate these things to the world over and over and over, that the divine is at one with us at all moments. That we are all, in essence, also at one with each other. And that this whole thing is one very large movement, albeit with countless smaller movements, right? So you start thinking about energy particles and the exchange, right? I read this article today that said something about like all atoms might be one atom, ATOM, not ADAM. And like these quantum physics stuff or doing all this, and it's unbelievable, right? This oneness in this, that's part of where he's playing. So what takes place on the cross and in the resurrection for him is a non-linear prism of truth. Aligning with our liberationist brothers and sisters, what takes place on the cross is a oneness of God with the suffering. The truth that love contains something deep and wounded within itself. The truth that love is vulnerable and cannot single-handedly control, or it no longer becomes love. The truth that violence and entropy is reality. Right? We don't live in a world where that isn't true. We don't live in a vacuum where we play with theories. The truth that Jesus is innocent and at one with all victims everywhere. The truth that God was at one with Jesus. The truth that the death of Jesus wasn't a requirement of love, but did become a revelation of love. The truth that mercy is greater than sacrifice. The truth that humanity's modern ancient story has been corrupted by an unholy trinity of existential insecurity, mimetic violence, and idolatrous hope in authoritative power, that if we could just get the power, things would be different. The truth that hope of the world lies in our willingness to admit our culpability in the way that these things play out. The truth that hope of our world lies in our willingness to be at one with the way of Jesus, returned from his murder, and marked with peace and patience and forgiveness. The truth that love is at one with everything in such a deep way that even the worst things can turn out to be the best things. And for him, these truths are part faith, part revelation, part fact, part myth. And that something happens in our loss. Right? That when I look to you and connect my oneness to you, self-giving of myself, something happens that connects to the at one-ment on the cross and in the resurrection and in, right? That the whole journey is of oneing. And what I've noticed in my own reality over the last 2 weeks is how much I use the word they and them. Right? And it's a challenge to those words. Now, I get that they're part of the English language, right? But it's very easy for me to them and they. What happens if the work of atonement is weeding? But not weeding in a place where I act like your experience is my experience. Because that's not the true wanting that he's talking about here. Right? It's that, some of the stuff that Roy shared with us on Sunday night. Roy's experience is not my experience. And to be one with Roy is not to say, now we have the same experience. That's just further oppression. So he's wanting to hearken into this play of liberation, mimetic, Christus Victor, all of these things playing together. And what you're seeing in current atonement theories is a draw back to the metaphor versus the dogma. Saying that something happens when we mechanize. in a way where something gets lost. And yet, I don't know about you, but I want to know how this stuff works. Right? So that's part of the challenge of these theories and how it plays. If you want to read another really good, I'm halfway through it, Theory of Atonement, you can read Derek's. Read by Derek Flood. It's in Amazon. Derek, raise your hands if you know that you're here. I know it's embarrassing to you. But it's beautiful. And it's well written, and it's clear, and it's able to be grasped, and it touches on so many of the things that we've talked about over the last 4 weeks. What I want you to hear as we close with these that are newer is that just because Augustine said it, or Luther, or Gustav Aulin, or pick your atonement writer, doesn't mean and make it that it's going to be useful for us. It doesn't mean that it won't either. But we can't stop recognizing that God is up to something in our world. And so as we close this on liberation and feminist atonement, rejecting sacrificial violence, I want to leave us with a challenge and an invitation and perhaps a bit of discomfort. Atonement has been framed in stories of violence, of sacrifices demanded, of debts paid, of victims sanctified. But part of what we explored tonight were voices from other theologies that call us to rethink. Who benefits from these narratives? Who gets left on the cross? Who keeps being told to suffer well for the sake of others? Cohn showed us that the cross and the lynching tree are bound in the same brutal history, where society's scapegoats are sacrificed to maintain the status quo. Feminist theologians have long exposed how atonement theories have justified the silencing and the suffering of women, teaching them that submission is holiness and that pain is redemptive. But what if the cross was never about God needing blood, but about God standing in solidarity with the oppressed? What if instead of divine demand of sacrifice, the cross reveals the truth of human violence and God's refusal to actually participate in it, and instead waiting 3 days later in the resurrection? So here's the challenge. Can we reject atonement theories that keep marginalizing those on the margins? Can we refuse to sanctify suffering and instead walk toward its eradication? Because as the feminist and liberation theologians remind us, a theology that justifies the suffering of the weak to soothe the power of the strong is not the gospel. So the question, what would it mean for us to live out an atonement that actually liberates rather than punishes? That reconciles without requiring blood? That invites us all, especially the most marginalized, into a community where no one is ever asked to suffer so another can be saved? Is that atonement worth living for? Is that an atonement worth fighting for? Is that an atonement worth keeping digging on? Perhaps we still haven't figured out what God is doing yet. And that's what this journey is all about, right? It's the reason mystery exists is to call us deeper into it. So, may you actually go in peace.